Right, good. I think we'll start. Thank you very much. Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming along this evening. I've worked out a kind of agenda, so I'll quickly tell you what I think the structure of the evening will be. So we'll start off just by quickly introducing ourselves and yourselves, so everybody knows who everybody is. And then I'll take like 60 seconds just to tell you where we've got so far with the project, but the bulk of the meeting will be a presentation by Natasha Rees, partner from Forsters Listers, to explain how the process of acquiring the freehold and then issuing the new leases would work if we're successful. We'll then have questions and answers, and I would suggest, in the interest of sort of good time management, we'll do the Q&A after Natasha has finished her presentation rather than as she goes along. And then we'll talk about what the next steps are going to be, with a view hopefully to be finishing by 8 o'clock. I've already mentioned, for the benefit of the people who are going to be watching the recording, I'll say that a signature sheet has gone around trying to capture everybody's complete contact details and just their signature of who's here. So just by way then of introductions, do come in. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Natasha Rees. I'm a partner at Forsters, which is a firm based in Mayfair, and we specialise in real estate and private wealth.
I'm Chris Ross. I live at number 18 Cavendish, and I've lived there for 30 years. This is a project I've had an interest in for a long time and not been able to get off the ground, but luckily Brinsley kind of stepped in and has got things underway. And I think I'm really here because we just thought it would be good to have someone who actually lives in the block and has lived there for a long time and, you know, has a sort of, you know, highly vested interest in the on-the-ground kind of situation now. So.
And I should, yes, thank you. I should probably say I'm Brinsley Dresden. My wife is operating the camera. We own number 12A, and I've known Chris as an acquaintance for many years since we moved to West Hampstead in 1995, and I've known Natasha for many years. We were colleagues, I've realised, until about 20 years ago we were colleagues. So we were colleagues from about 23 years ago until about 20 years ago. So perhaps if we could briefly start over here, just to say your name and flat number, so we...
Scott Ackman, flat 56.
Thank you.
Jeremy Sanders, flat 31 and 22.
Daniela Siretz, flat 38.
Leo Henning, flat 37.
Lorraine Kai, flat 9. I'm one of the 3 with short leases.
Elliot Hankins, flat 25. Steve Pratt, flat 19. Hamid Bowden, flat 8.
Sophie Brand, flat 5.
Okay.
Steve Folks, owner of flat 14, but we don't. David White, flat 40.
Annabelle Jack, flat 17.
Great. Well, thank you very much for everybody for introducing yourselves. It's really helpful to be able to put names to faces. So very quick status report, just to remind you and remind the people who'll be watching the recording where we are. So we all received, I think, the letter from Wallace & Co. dated 15th of April when they served notice under the Landlord and Tenant Act. And as you know, we've got, as it happens, 1 month from today, I think it is, we're actually strictly 1 month from yesterday, the 14th, to accept that notice, failing which the freehold will be sold to an unnamed third party. Natasha might cover that off in more detail, but Type Team will be selling it. If we don't buy it, it will go to a third party. Yes, yes. So a lot of the first part of this project has been about getting everybody together, getting hold of everybody, which we've managed to get hold of 36 people, and thank you, a number of people have been really helpful giving me email addresses for other people, which has made the process work much more successfully. So I've managed to contact 36 people. There are 3 leaseholders who I've written to twice now by post, but I haven't been able to get a response. It may be that they no longer live in the flat and the tenants have ignored the letters, or quite properly haven't opened the letters, not addressed to them. So that's an obstacle at the moment to a degree. And then the 40th flat, is it registered in the names of the 2 directors of Type Team, the freehold company, and they issued themselves a 999-year lease with a peppercorn rent about 30 odd years ago, which might give you a clue as to what kind of lease is it that you would like to have. And so I haven't bothered to contact them. The other thing that I've done with lots of assistance, particularly from Chris, was we spoke to a project management company that specialises in helping people do what we're doing. We were not bowled over by their contribution, and we've kind of realised that actually we've reached a point now where we don't really need their input. We spoke to 2 sets of lawyers, to Natasha and also to a chap called Graham Jaffe from JPC Law, and Graham was very, very helpful, very personable, but for the reasons that were set out in my email on Sunday, I kind of came to the conclusion that Natasha was the person to go with, and that we do need to just sort of crack on now. We've only got a month left to get everybody on board, so there's not really time more to spend on that process. And then the other thing I've done is got the basic terms of all of the leases. So we know there are 3 people on 51-year leases. There are 24 people, I think, on 91 years left, I should say, strictly speaking. And then there's a couple of others who I think have fairly recently extended their leases by 90 years. So they are on about 180 years now. And then there's that one lease. So I can give you these numbers if you want them. And of course, don't forget, we are videoing this. The plan, if I can make it work, is to upload this video onto a private YouTube channel and then circulate a link, and everybody will be able to access it from there and watch it back. I'm sure you won't tire of watching it over and over again in the summer months. Natasha, over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Brinsley. Right. I thought what I'll do is I'll run through, just give you a little bit of background of Forsters and our enfranchisement team. I have here a pack which basically sets out a little bit about our enfranchisement experience, our fee quote, and our CVs of the people who would be working on this in order to help you acquire the freehold. So you can take that away with you when you go. And essentially, I'm a partner at Forsters, and I head up the enfranchisement group. And when I say enfranchisement, there are various ways that you can acquire your freehold. And with blocks, there are 2 key ways. The first is the 1993 Act, which allows you to acquire the freehold by serving a notice on your landlord and then coming to an agreement over the premium or going to the tribunal if you can't agree. And the other way that you do it is if your landlord wants to sell the freehold, they have to, under the 1987 Act, offer it to you first. And you then have 2 months in which to accept. And if you don't accept, they're then free to sell it on the open market. So what Type Team have done is they've gone down the 1987 Act route because they're required to under law, and if they didn't, it's a criminal offence. So you're now in a position where you can, you've got this 2-month period when you can accept their offer. What we normally advise in this situation is you've got to decide whether this is going to be the right price or whether you should go down the 1993 Act route. And I have a number of valuers that I speak to, and the valuer that I sort of discussed this with has given me a sort of rough guesstimate of the valuation. And it does appear that this is probably a very good price, and that you wouldn't achieve a much better price if you went under the 1993 Act. So the other advantage of this process as well is that it's much quicker. There's a very sort of strict timetable, and you also are entitled to recover your costs from the landlord if they withdraw at any stage after you've nominated a company. So there are advantages to this route, and if you can reach a decision now to pursue this, it's probably the best way to go, given that the figures also stack up. So essentially where you are is you've received your notice. The notice, it says in it £350,000 is the price, and by the 14th of June you have to serve an acceptance notice. Now, in order to serve that acceptance notice, there needs to be over 50% of the tenants or leaseholders have to participate in that acceptance notice. And the best way to evidence that is by entering into a participation agreement. And that's an agreement that binds everyone and sets out what proportion of the premium you're going to pay and what proportion of the costs, the legal costs and the valuer's costs you're going to pay. So the participation agreement is essentially a sort of legal contract between all of you, and it will determine what you're going to pay, and it will bind everyone into paying once you've started the process. It also sets out what happens if, for example, someone sells their flat during the process and things like that. But that is usually what you enter into first. You also have to nominate someone to acquire the freehold, and we usually recommend that you do that through a freehold company, which we set up, and you're all listed as members of that company. It's a company that's limited by guarantee, and it's a company that's specially set up, and the articles are specially drawn up for management of blocks. So that's what we recommend as well. So you have to do that fairly quickly. Once you've served your notice of acceptance, there's then another 2-month period. And during this 2-month period, you then have to nominate the company. So that gives you a little bit more time, essentially, if you want time to get money together and organise how you're going to fund everything. So that takes you to the 14th of August. And then once you've made your nomination, the landlord then has to send out a contract within the next month. So around about the 14th of September, you should receive your contract. It might be a bit sooner. And you then have another 2 months in which to sign and return the contract. And at that point, you then have 7 days after that to exchange. So you're looking at having to come up with a 10% deposit around about early November. And then, as stipulated in the notice itself, it says that completion has to be 20 days after exchange. So you're looking at early December for completion. So that's the sort of likely timetable that you're going to have to follow if you decide to go down this route. I just thought I'd touch on funding, because obviously I'm sure that you're all very sort of keen to know what you'll have to pay in terms of the premium and what you'll have to pay in terms of costs. I've done a fee estimate, and we have an estimate from a valuer, and that's all in this pack. And it sort of works out at about $2,500 per leaseholder, and that's inclusive of VAT. So that's
What's that cost?
Yeah, and that's inclusive of VAT. That's assuming 30 participants.
On the assumption that there are 30 participating tenants at least.
And also that includes, I think, the valuer's costs as well.
And so, obviously, the more people that participate, the cheaper it becomes for each leaseholder. There's also the premium. Now, what normally happens with the premium is it's apportioned. So you instruct the valuer to look at all the flats, all the lease lengths, all of the different sort of freehold or vacant possession values of the flats, and they produce a schedule which basically sets out what share of the premium you should pay. So, for example, the shorter leases will have to pay a higher premium than the much longer leases. Having had a look at the lease lengths, and again a very rough estimate from our valuer is that the short leases would be looking at paying around 50,000, maybe 50 to 53,000. That's the 51-year leases, and the 91-year leases would be about 7,500. And then I think the 141-year leases would be about £500, so it drops down quite significantly. So that's roughly, and I have to say I'm not a valuer, I'm a lawyer, but that's the sort of rough advice I've had from our...
That take them all to 999.
That enables you to acquire the freehold, and then you will all be granted 999-year leases at a peppercorn rent.
That's based on 30.
Yes, again, 30 participating.
Sorry, what was that question?
Based on 30 participants, those figures.
Well, in fact, sorry.
That was the question.
Yes. It doesn't matter actually how many are participating to affect the premium, provided someone's paying for the non-participating tenants. Yeah.
But have you based it on 30 participants?
No, this is just the price that will come out for. So this all adds up to 350,000, but you'll need to fund if someone doesn't participate. there needs to be funding for those flats that don't participate. So that's something I'm just about to come on to actually. But so essentially, if you have a 51-year lease, you'll know your premium will be around about 50,000, and then you'll have the costs on top, 2.5. If your lease is 91 years, then it's 7,500 roughly, plus the costs on top of that. So you have a rough idea of what it will be.
Might be worth mentioning, just by point of comparison, I've spoken to two people who I believe were on 90-year, let's say they're on about 91 years, so they're in that group, who fairly recently have extended now. Bear in mind, they've got another 90 years, so they haven't gone to 999 years, they've only bought another 90 years. The total costs, including all the legal costs and surveyor's costs, one of them spent about 18,000 and one of them spent about 16,000. So the cost that Natasha's talking about, obviously for the people on 91 years to go this route, to pay roughly 7.5 and roughly 2.5, so 10 in total, that compares very favourably with recent experience that people have had, and you're getting a much better deal in the end because you're getting the share of the freehold and the 999-year lease.
999-year leases are only given to those people participating in buying freehold.
Yeah.
Anyone that doesn't might has to extend their lease through law.
That's exactly right.
I'll just repeat the question because for the people who are going to be watching the video. So it's going to be a bit boring, but the question was, what happens to the people who don't participate? And, do they don't get a 999? So that's the question. What happens to the non-participants?
The non-participants, they won't have a share in the freehold company, and they won't be granted a 999-year lease. And so in the future, if they want to extend, they'll have to come to the new freehold company owned by all the participating tenants and request an extension, either under the Act or a voluntary extension, and they would have to pay for that in the usual way. I mean, just one thing to add on the funding, that the valuer did look at the freehold values, and working back from the £350,000 for the freehold, he came to a figure of, it worked out or equated, when you input all of the usual deferment rates and capitalisation rates, to a figure of about £500,000 per flat. So if that's less than the current market value, then 350,000 is apparently a good figure.
Can you just repeat that last bit?
I'm trying to remember how he explained it, but essentially you have to input deferment rate and capitalisation rates into an equation when you're looking at the freehold value and working it out per flat. And when you do that and you work back from the £350,000 for the freehold, it equates to a roughly £500,000 per flat freehold vacant possession value. So if the flats are worth more than that, then it seems to be a sensible price. But I haven't looked at the freehold.
So that formula would say, if each flat, if each individual flat would have a market value of £500,000 or more, then the £350,000 price of the freehold makes sense. Or is he saying he's got a sort of an industry standard formula, and when he applies it, he's expecting that the freehold would be worth 500. So if they're only asking 350, it's the former.
It's the former. Yes.
Okay.
It's the former. So essentially, if the flats are worth 500 or more, then this is probably a good price.
I think we all very much hope they're worth 500 or more.
Well, I think historically they have been, but the last flat sold for 500,000, and it didn't have a short lease, so they may have used that as a benchmark.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think the only other thing I wanted to move on to in terms of funding was the possibility of a white knight stepping in and funding the non-participating flats. If there are two ways to fund the non-participating flats. Either you can do it collectively, and you can all join together and share the extra cost, and then you will benefit in the future when those tenants want to extend. Or one individual could come forward and fund those non-participating flats, and they're usually called a white knight because they're stepping in and basically funding them, and they then get an overriding lease of those flats. So in the future, when they extend, they're the ones that make the money, and there are quite a few people that do that basically as an investment vehicle. So there are people who do that.
Can I just clarify that if a white knight, a third party, comes in and steps into the shoes of the non-participants, then any amount of money that is paid by those who are non-participating, if they subsequently want to extend, will not go to the freeholder, it will go to the white knight.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's why.
earlier.
Yeah.
So
That's absolutely the case. That's why
Right.
it's a sort of investment for them.
Right.
So they are the ones that will benefit from any
Right.
lease extension claim, and they will collect the ground rent for those non-participating flats.
But the 360 just has to be made up by everybody, whether it's white knight and participants or all participants.
Well,
The 350 has to be made up by everybody. It doesn't really matter how, is what you're saying.
well, the 350, if you have a white knight who's coming in to fund the non-participating
Yeah.
flats, they will pay
They'll
that
pay their
portion.
pro rata
yeah,
share.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So I can imagine a world in which, say, the 3 short leaseholds didn't participate. So then the white knight would pay, let's say, 150 in round numbers, leaving 200,000 to be paid by the remaining flats that were taking part. Which, you know,
But it does mean there's a potential friction, because if the participants have all got 999-year leases and those who don't participate don't have long leases, and then they want to extend their leases, they won't be negotiating with the freeholder, they'll be negotiating with the white knight.
Yes.
So there's not an alignment of interest necessarily with
No.
all leaseholders when it comes to things like service charges, because there'll be this third-party white knight sitting there
Yeah.
hoping to make more money than he or she or it has paid out to
Yeah.
the freeholder company.
Yeah, I mean, if it's possible to share the burden and pay for the non-participating flats by sharing it, that's usually the best course. But if not,
Could you just explain, if we do that and people are funded, we all fund the non-participants, when money is then paid by the leaseholders who eventually will have to extend their leases, that will go to the company, and will it then be paid back out to all the lessees who funded it?
yes, and there are 2 ways you could do. You can either do that just using the freehold company, or you can set up a separate freehold company, a separate company that's sort of a non-participant company that's funded by all of you, and then you all will benefit from it in the future. It just saves the problem of when someone sells. So if you sell your flat and you want to move on, you'll still benefit from the fact that you funded the...
But there's still a tension, because those people who haven't participated will be busy saying, I want to extend it as a lower price as possible, and the rest of us, who are effectively owning the freehold, will want it to be as high a price as possible.
Yeah,
And
but
that's
there is a mechanism under the 93 Act for them to get their lease extension, and it can't be unreasonable. If it is, it will go to the tribunal and they will set the figure. So you can never charge an
No,
extortion.
in your experience, it is better, I'm sorry to go on about this, but it is better if everybody could participate and not have a white knight in there, is it?
I think, yes, I
That's
think
what
that's
that's what I
probably
meant.
the best way if you can, yeah, because it does keep it within the block and within all of the leaseholders.
I mean, the other possibility. So you've got a question as well, I think.
Yeah, it was just more about if there was a white knight involved, and when it comes down to block management decisions, do they then have a higher say, or is it equal?
No, they don't have any say actually. I mean, all they have is an overriding lease which sits above the long lease. So the freehold will still be owned by you.
But they won't be represented on the freehold.
No.
I think it's very important that, because what you don't want to find is that we who participated want to do something to the block,
Yeah.
and they want to be bloody minded and say, well, we don't really care because we have no interest other than our financial one.
Yeah.
So I think it's a question.
Yeah.
So just to ask, sorry, I don't know if it's Q&A time. Just on that, is it not that the white knight person gets allocated the percentage that they pay for, and then the money that comes in via the freehold and the extended leases gets shared out, and they get a proportion, so it directly attributes to the flats that they are taking up the slack for, as it were?
Well, you can do it that way, but
Because I thought if someone as an investment vehicle took up the slack for the money that the others didn't pay for, I thought they would then own a higher percentage, or they would get a higher percentage of the payout as a dividend from the lease extensions?
We haven't set it up like that before. It's a bit complicated, that, because then they fall under the freehold company. Yeah, so we tend to prefer to keep it completely separate. So
If we use an example of, say there's flat 13, and I'll use flat 13 deliberately because there isn't a flat 13, and I don't want to insult anybody, but say flat 13 decided not to participate, then as I understand it, the White Knight would step in and say, okay, well, flat 13, if they were participating, would be paying, let's say, £50,000 because it's a short lease. So I'm going to put in that £50,000 share in order to kind of make the whole thing, so the whole thing can go forward. If the owner of the short lease has a change of heart and then decides they want to get a 999-year lease, or if they sell and somebody else buys it and they decide, which is probably more realistic, then they've got to come to me and they've got to agree a price with me, and that will be then.
yeah, the money won't come into the company. The ground rent and lease extension monies will go to the.
But the service charge will still be paid to the
Yes.
So it's only the ground rent and any premium.
Yeah.
Which really means that the way that you've said that it's calculated, the price per flat or per lease, really is only, the only sort of factor is the lease length, because it doesn't take into account, because otherwise that wouldn't work. That only works that the White Knight is receiving purely lease extension amount, and there's no other, I mean, because some blocks, I don't think ours has that, but some blocks you have to pay a fee if you want to change the windows, or if you want to, even if you do interior work, sometimes you have to pay the freeholder. But it seems that in terms of the calculation formula, the only thing driving the amount per flat for the premium bit is lease extension value.
And the ground rent.
And the ground rent, the core income of a lease. And so the White Knight is only getting that bit.
What are the ground rents? Are they all the same?
I think they vary a little bit. There's a lot of people who are on. So the question was whether the ground rents are all the same. A lot of people, the 24 leases that are got 91 years remaining, I think they all have the same structure of ground rent, and I think the 141-year leases, a lot of those have the same. So essentially, from memory, I think the 91-year leases, they started off originally with maybe £25 a year ground rent. I think they've flipped to 100 years.
Today, actually,
Right.
Come in.
Right.
We've just had a demand today
Yes.
for ground rent.
How much was it? Sorry.
For 90, I'm on a 91-year lease. It's £100.
£100 a year, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it will be for quite a long time now.
I'm on 51 and it's £20.
Right. Yes.
Short lease.
Yeah. So there are three main types of lease, which within the groups they are consistent with each other, but there are differences between those three groups. And then there's the one or two anomalies at the end. Shall we? Can I just suggest what we do is we'll let Natasha just finish off,
Actually, I mean,
or
that
you're
was
done.
My last point was the
Okay,
White Knight, so,
fine.
Yeah.
So do you want to ask
I
a?
just was stating the obvious, but there could be multiple White Knights.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think the group preference would ideally be that we can all participate, but we can all foresee a circumstance where somebody can't pay that additional but really want to participate as a lease. So.
And I think, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, based upon the way you're proposing to set this up, what happens if you decide to sell a flat, your flat? Can you sell the flat but still retain your interest in the freehold, or is the way you're setting it up basically tying your ownership of the flat to your share of the freehold?
Yeah, no, the participation agreement sets out what happens, and also the company once it's set up. And essentially, once you sell, you transfer your membership of the company over to the new
sell
owner.
the flat with a share of the freehold. So, and that's because of the way you're proposing for us to set it up. So it's not that we're shareholders of a freehold company, not three people coming together, for example, and just owning the freehold. We're directors of a company that owns the freehold.
Well, it is a freehold company. It's limited by guarantee, the company that we set up, and there will be two directors and it, you know, it's set up.
But is
in
there
the,
an obligation that when you sell a property, you must sell the
Yes.
share of freehold?
Yeah.
yeah,
And that's
So-
part of
yeah,
the memo
that's
analysis.
part of it, and that's what we recommend because.
And that's very standard now. And certainly,
That would be the same, for example, the type team that currently own it, the fact that they have a flat, or is that different?
I wouldn't draw an analogy with type team, but I think
Similar in a way.
it is very common, I think, these days, that you will see, you know, you can either buy a lease on a flat, or some flats, you are getting a lease, but you are also getting a share of the freehold, but that share is tied to the ownership of the long lease. So you sell the long lease, and as part of that, automatically, you don't have a choice in the matter. Your share in the company that owns the freehold goes with your lease when you sell your lease.
So in terms of getting any investment back, let's say it's £7,000 for a 91-year lease, you know, you should be expecting to get the money that you're investing back when you sell the flat because it's worth more. But there's you're not making any money out of the company, which is really what the conversation about was before, that anyone else participating is under a different arrangement, and they then might make some money on their investment.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, you get, you know, you get a new 999-year lease and a share of freehold. So when you sell that,
But I don't think that you were saying that someone else might be making money out of that sort of white knight concept, and that's what I was talking about earlier. I don't think they're actually making really a profit because the price what they put in was calculated based on what the lease extension cost would be coming back out again, so they'll just be getting it back.
No, because they might make a profit if in 10 years' time they suddenly say, well, we're not going to charge you £7,500.
Except that the lease extension fees are not fixed, but I mean, I think it is correct that there's guidance as to how you can't go on reasonable amounts.
No, but as their lease gets shorter,
As their lease
so
gets
the
shorter,
value
it
goes
goes
Yeah.
up, so they could wait. They could think, great, in 30 years' time, suddenly we've got more value because we're back at 50.
It's an
that's another way of,
Yeah.
of making
What
money.
happens if a white knight comes along, just take number 13, but the leaseholder never asks for a long lease and just whittles down? What does the white knight have then?
Well, at the end of the lease, there's an act, there's a 1989 Act which comes into force, and the tenant under that lease then automatically, unless they serve notices, becomes an assured tenant.
Right.
And they'll stay an assured tenant unless they breach one of the assured tenancy rules, and a rent is fixed. So they start getting a rent, and they also have a right to recover possession if they breach any of the assured.
So the white knight would then come into the flat.
Own the flat.
Can I
Yeah,
The
they probably wouldn't have.
take your question? I just wanted to come back, because I think, if I may just answer that question, I'll put my 2 pennies worth in, and Natasha can correct me if I'm wrong, because I think effectively your question was sort of, if you now hold a 91-year lease, what's in it for you to shell out another £10,000? So there's a number of things. One is that, speaking to both Natasha and to Graham, the figure of 80 years has come up as being a critical point. If you have a lease with less than 80 years left on it, then it's not nearly as attractive as security for a bank or a mortgage company, a building society. I did some research and realised that, for example, your choice of rates, the choice of lenders that will give you and the deals that they will give you, is reduced once you get below 80
Maybe I
years.
should just explain why. The reason is that at 80 years and below, this concept of marriage value comes into the premium calculation. So if you apply for a new lease under the 93 Act, it costs significantly more the minute you drop below 80 years than it would above 80 years, because then it's just a factor of your ground rent. So it's a really drastic change. So,
I've been through a lease extension before on a property, so I echo everything you're saying. That was £20,000 just for the lease extension on a property that was worth far less than the Cavendish mansion flat. So that bit, I'm in no doubt about.
Yes.
It's more the legal setup, but I think you've answered the question, which is that the way we set it up here as owners, we're tied. So when we sell, we have to sell as well. So we don't make as a shareholder. You can only be a shareholder or a member of this company whilst you own the flat. I think that's
yes.
simply.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. It's in the company constitution. I don't know whether there's a corporate lawyer in the room who would know this without embarrassing themselves, but there's kind of, I think it's called drag and tag rights and things, but basically you sell the lease and your shareholding goes with it. And that's not up for debate. That's in the constitution of the company and probably reflected in the terms of the lease as well.
But what happens if everybody participates and pays for those who are not participating? In other words, there's no white knight, and then you sell your interest. In a way, you're not getting back anything extra for the fact that you've also funded.
Well, that's what you can set up this separate company, right, which is a company which takes the money from the non-participants. And so you can continue to share in that even when you leave.
That's relevant to that gentleman's question. Yeah. So you can hang on to that bit, otherwise you'd never get any money.
And that's for you to decide when you agree the participation agreement, how you're going to do it. Are you going to just leave and say goodbye and let that investment sit with the freehold company for the block, or do you want to take your non-participant investment so you have your separate company? And that's so you have those two options.
So you calculate at the start if there were 30 participants and how much each person would owe approximately. It would be possible to find out how much that would be. If it's 25 participants, I think the minimum is 19 or 20, or it's 38. And also, what happens if the short leaseholders don't involve if they opt out? Is it possible to have a range to understand our investment commitment? Not just, or are we assuming 30 people are in?
All of these. Well, the premium always stays the same, but the cost is based on 30 participants.
So each flat, if you like, if you could make a list of each flat, and against each flat number, you would write the premium. So for the 51-year leases, that would be roughly £50,000, 7.5 for the 91 and 500 for the longer ones. That doesn't change. So the way we have to get 19 participants to sign the agreement, to sign the participation agreement. We have to get 19 on board because there are 40 flats in the block. 4 belong to one company. The gentleman from Mill Lane Properties, I don't think is here, is he? Which is a shame because hopefully they will get involved, but then they don't qualify under the Act. So we've got to get a majority of the 36, so we get to 19. If we then, provided we get to 19, then we're in the legal position to go forward. So then it's a question of just finding the funding that the people are going to pay out for each flat, and then we can work out. I mean, it's basically 2.5 times 30, whatever that is, and then you divide that.
It's kind of chicken or egg. Am I in and making a commitment when I don't know how much it would be until everybody else has said they're in?
Yeah.
And that's the dichotomy of it. But until we know whether it's short leases or long leases or whoever's going to make up that, it's difficult to say. So I think there's a worst case and a best case scenario.
Given the shortage of time, should you not start looking for a white knight just so we've got someone there in case everyone who is participating doesn't want to make up the difference?
But that assumes a commercial white knight, whereas we also want to ask ourselves whether there's anyone amongst us who may wish to make more of an investment, or if we know anybody. Going out to a commercial white knight will have its own price on this.
Yeah, I mean, our valuer will have contacts who are white knight contacts if you want them. But as you say, you might want to just check amongst yourselves whether there's anyone who wants to take that role. But if not, yeah, it would be fairly quick, I think.
So what happens when we start on this journey and then, say 30 people committed, and then as we came down to the wire, we got close to 20 people that could go through with it. How does that?
Well, that's what the participation agreement is for, because if you all decide and you all confirm that you want to participate, you will all sign up to a participation agreement, and that binds you into the process. So you can't actually just sort of drop out and go,
so
actually.
For example, for me, I haven't had 50,000 lying around. I'll need to go through a process of looking at remortgaging, etc. So where would that leave me in terms of putting my hat forward?
Well, that's, again, the participation agreement is very much an agreement amongst yourselves. But we recommend that people are bound in. The reason being that if you drop below the number of 19 during the process, you have to let the landlord know, and then they can go and sell it to someone else. So there always has to be 19 or more. Yes.
Notify the landlord that you're not proceeding.
Yes.
But would it be better to just have in 2 stages, to get the 19 so that we can then trigger it, and then once we're in play, see whether or not people can fund it. Because
Yes,
if you're asking people to fund up front,
You can do that, and that's why the second 2-month period is quite useful.
Yeah.
So if you want to do it that way, we can get the 19 signed up and serve the acceptance notice, and then you've got another 2 months in which
but
to
isn't that
find.
logic? That must be the right thing to do.
But
Because
so
then,
then the 19 would potentially be liable for a greater share of the costs because it could potentially be only 19 participating. So it should be.
Well, you only have 1 month after the acceptance notice has gone in, because then after that period, the liability for costs starts happening. So that's why we suggest that you try and sort this all out initially, because the second 2-month process, as I say, after 1 month, cost liabilities can start occurring if either party withdraws.
But I guess the point is, even if I'm quite interested in this. For me, this makes sense, and it's something that I want to do. But I also, need to be mindful of costs and things. And so I'd rather know when I'm signing the participation agreement what my cost allocation will be, because I'd like to know that there are 25 other people joining me or just 18 other people joining me.
Yeah. Well, that's why the participation
Then
agreement.
we say, based on the costs of our portion, we as a flat owner put our hand forward and say we would take up the cost of
For the premium
for
bit.
my premium or not, and then we look at what's left, and then we say, okay, we need to look at White Knight, or alternatively, do we want to split it amongst ourselves, and what does that look like?
But you're only talking about the premium component, but I'm also talking about the cost component, which is the £2,500 per flat, which is based on 30 participants. But that does change not hugely, but it does change reasonably highly if you're talking about 19 participants.
Yes.
So I think there's a two-phase response then. Are you willing to go in on costs? For example, I would be happy to contribute on costs, and if I fail to get a mortgage, then that is my loss, but at least it buys me time to participate.
but those costs are only if you go the whole way. If we drop out, because within that month it's obvious that no one can go ahead, then I presume the cost will not be 2,500.
If you do it within that, before the 1 month.
So the 2,500 is only if we've actually been successful. If within that 1 month period,
Because it
it's
includes
obvious
all
no
of the
one-
costs of
we've
of
had a
everything.
good go, we can't do it, there's no White Knight, end of story, then it will be much less.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the payment schedule we talked about, and that is something we need to sort of perhaps go into a bit more detail. But I think that the concept generally is that if everybody sort of is agreed with this, as an initial sort of deposit, people would pay, I think a sensible amount would be £500 ahead towards the costs. And I don't know if, and that gives us then a month to collect in the £500 and to get people to sign the participation agreement, so that Natasha is in a position on or before the 14th of June to serve the acceptance notice to Simon Sirota at Wallace. And certainly I think it's quite possible that Mr. Sirota might say, well, I want to see 19 signatures so that I know you're not just making this up. You've got to prove it. Yes, he likes to know that this has all been done properly. So we've got a month, doesn't give us very long, so you're risking essentially £500, but that does then allow us to move forward. I'm hoping that we will get a lot more than 19 participants, because I think certainly for everybody, for the 24 people who are on 91 years, it makes absolute sense to do this, and hopefully is, affordable. I appreciate for the people on 51 years, it's more of a challenge. And even for the people who have got the long leases and are only going to be paying the £500 premium, just to come back to the point the gentleman was making at the back, there are still financial advantages, because we would hopefully be looking at reducing the service charges, potentially, because it seems to be very widely held view that all kinds of commissions are paid to freeholders, particularly on the insurance, the buildings insurance, and also the terms of the buildings insurance are made deliberately rather generous. So there's often savings to be achieved on the service charges. Plus you're getting rid of the ground rent, which, not a fortune, but it's something. And of course the other, if you're on 91 years in particular, in the reasonably foreseeable future, one way or another, you're going to be looking at a lease extension of many thousands of pounds. So it still makes sense. That last point, of course, doesn't apply to the people on 140 years, but the first 2 points do. And the other big thing for me that's attractive, even if you're on 140 years, is control. Because we do know, we know as much as we can possibly know, that the freehold is going to change hands within the near future. Type Team are selling. Somebody, one of the other leaseholders rang up Mr. Sirota and spoke to him, and he explained that one of the two gentlemen that owns Type Team has died, so his estate is being wound up. So I'm pretty certain that the freehold is going to be sold, and of course we have no way of knowing who it's going to be sold to or what kind of freeholder they will be. So this will allow us to take control. I hesitate to say take back control because we never had control, but to acquire control and avoid this kind of uncertainty of not knowing who the new freeholder would be.
And there's other costs coming, that garden wall that's currently...
Yeah, there's a hidden cost there, a silly cost.
Should
Frankly, if we all owned it, we just organise a bit of work and we take it down and everybody can, we can just have more control about what we do rather than what we'll end up doing if they continue to...
So just for the people on the...
for it to be replaced.
Yes, so the people on the tape, there is a question over the wall at the rear of the property, which is not in great repair. It's going to need to have something done with it, either some kind of repair job or something. So there are questions. At least if we own the freehold, we would have a say in how that's dealt with and how much it costs.
How is the freehold company typically managed? Because obviously decision making by committee is quite difficult. And you mentioned before that there's usually two directors, so we all own a share in terms of being members of the freehold company, but it's managed by two directors. And how does that, in your experience, work?
Well, then what normally happens is you appoint a firm of managing agents to manage, but you're the ones that decide on which managing agents.
Are they also the directors, or who's actually...
No, well, you'll have a firm of managing agents managing the building, but it'll be the freehold company will be, the directors will...
But who are the directors of the freehold company?
Well, that's yet to be decided.
To be decided.
I mean, yes, and we could, to be honest with you, I would suggest in the short term, it's myself and Chris, because she lives in the building, she knows an awful lot about the building, and I think it's quite attractive an idea that a resident is one of the directors. Can have more than two.
You can have any number.
I'm not desperate to be a director of the company for the foreseeable future. No.
But there is, once that all happens, then, you have to have AGMs, we can resign. If you don't want us there, you can elect whoever, it becomes much more fluid, but it was really just to sort of get this process expedited.
But and to you,
it's obviously different when you've got 3 flats in a Victorian terrace that's run by a company, because then everyone's a director and you rotate, over the years everyone takes, but it's different for 40. So I just wanted
to your point, there's a separate thing called right to manage, right? This exercise is not about us directly managing the block. I think there is always going to be a firm of managing agents, but rather than them reporting to Type Team, they will be reporting to the company that we own.
That might be a working assumption, but something to be debated down the line once we've got over the...
Yes, exactly. It's a longer term thing.
And see, how much energy there is for people to actually...
Yeah, I mean, it might be that we, carry on indefinitely with Hathaways. I'm not prejudging that, but
the process is that we all get bogged down by the minutiae and looking at endless questions, whereas we have to stand back when we're looking at this in the next month and A, get questions out as quickly as possible and shared, and B, think about it in terms of there's many people that have gone through this process before. It's clearly in our best interest to have control and not be, charged as such, because they're only doing it for profit, and we need to look at that first as a way to get through the next month and look at our own liabilities and possibilities. Let's see where we can get to, because I think, Chris, after living there 30 years, how many times has this come up over the years? Many. And, it does make a difference in value to all of our properties.
You're right, we have been focusing on some technical questions.
Yeah.
doesn't feel like a good thing to do, or it's just too hard. But the big picture is going to be great.
I mean, we tend to find that, I mean, I think you're very well organised. I've been in lots of, see lots of tenants in lots of different blocks. And I think that the key to making it work is to have 2 or 3 people as a sort of central point of contact for the solicitors and valuer. And also just for them, all contact to be limited to those 3 or 2 or whoever you nominate. Also to sort of get a fighting fund together and to set up the company as soon as possible so that you can either have a bank account opened or register the company as the client. And I think, I mean, it's, as I say, it's very well organised at the moment. I think you can certainly take it forward, but you just need to sort of take these certain steps fairly quickly.
We need the company open. I realise you're saying as soon as possible, but is there a requirement to do it before the month is up?
Well, I think I've set it out in my note. These are the usual steps that we do. Is appoint 2 or 3 people to be the sort of leaders of the working party. Have a fighting fund put in place, either in a bank account or in our client account. And the reason we say set up the company is because then we can open and accept money on behalf of the company at Forsters. So there, and then you can start, getting the participation out, emailed to everyone so that they can have a look at it. You can agree how you're going to fund it, and you can also instruct the valuer to tell you exactly what premiums you're going to be paying.
So I have a slight curveball question, and not to distract from the number 1 gold medal, which is getting public freehold. As a ground floor tenant, there's obviously a back garden that nobody but the ground floor gets access to, really. I mean, obviously you can go around the side, but I'm yet to ever see someone in there. Is a way of potentially funding the purchase of freehold to effectively sell off those garden plots to each of the flats, or is that a complication too far and too hard?
Well, again, it's very much for you to decide amongst yourselves, because essentially at the end of the day you will acquire the freehold, and you will all be agreeing to grant 999-year leases of your flats. What you do with the common parts is governed very much by your leases, so you have to check the residential leases, and then if you do want to do something with any common parts that you feel that can be assigned to individuals or individual leaseholders, you would all have to amend the leases when you grant your 999-year leases.
If you've got the leases open anyway,
yeah,
and you're reissuing them. It just struck me as a way that could minimise costs and totality.
There is one other problem, is the non-participating tenants' leases will continue. So again, that might be a barrier to that sort of idea.
That's actually an interesting point. So you say that the existing leases are unchanged other than that they're extended to 999. I'd sort of almost thought that they would all be new leases on modern template versions.
They can be. They will. I mean, they will be. If you have 30 participants, we would draft 30 new leases based on your current leases, because they would have to fit with the non-participant leases. But they would be in modern form, and they would all be granted in modern form.
So when you say they have to fit with the other leases, it's just on common terms points?
Yes, for example, the service charge all has to add up. They have to cover the same common parts.
But in terms of other rights and things,
yes.
I mentioned, for example, I know that at the moment I think to change windows is something that the freeholder charges for, I believe, and so those are things that I think
you can all decide on those for your leases.
I just wanted to know, I mean, the service charge is due at the end of next month.
So carry on as normal. It's not.
I'm sorry about that, okay.
Sorry. Yes, it's certainly not in our interest collectively.
We carry on.
You carry on.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There's also a sinking fund involved that has to be maintained, and it would be complicated to deal with all of that right now.
As an incentive for everyone that goes into this, for example, if there was flats that didn't go along with it and they decided to sell at some point in the future after we've all set up the freehold company, could we set a set figure that any new leaseholder that doesn't have a share of the freehold can buy into the share of the freehold for, say, 30,000, and then all that gets split between the current freeholders?
You wouldn't want to do that.
Well, that's going to very much depend on how we fund in the next few months, how we fund the non-participating flats. So, if we do have either one of our number says, actually, what, I'm looking for an investment, I will cover the cost of the non-participating flats, then that investor is going to expect to get the return on their investment. And of course, the other thing is that the more you run down what's left on the length of the lease, the higher the premium will get.
What I mean is the person selling their flat, if they never walk into the freehold, so the white knight owns their proportion, they sell their flat, the new owner of that flat has no option to buy into the freehold? Or they could, but
Well,
we can set a nominal figure, but make a little bit of money.
No, because he'll be paying the white knight.
Yeah, because the white knight is covering the cost today,
And once he's
not
paid
us.
the white knight's interest in that flat will disappear. And he would,
And then
that buyer will
yeah.
effectively have got the freedom.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't want to sell it because obviously I'd then go, it's set, I don't need to do anything for a while.
We know nothing about the new buyer, do we? The current buyer.
No.
But, one thing's for sure for all of us, they're only going into it to try and make money. So, it just has to be better if we can do this. Because
Yes.
it's not just control. We're going to be subjected to whatever the whims are of this new buyer.
And they're profiteering.
And they're trying to make money.
Yeah.
And that's a fact.
Just out of curiosity, the new buyer, and I really am hoping this process works very well, but if for some reason we didn't manage to buy the freehold now, the new buyer, would they be susceptible to us then using the second route, the one that's initiated by leaseholders? I know that's been tried before, it is hard to get the leaseholders.
They would be,
but they would be completely
would.
okay.
yeah.
Well, they would be, they might not be very keen to do it. They probably wouldn't be. But anyway,
But we can, what I mean
You
is
can
if
force
the
them.
we can force them.
Yeah.
But it's a more expensive, it will incur greater legal costs, and it will take longer.
It is more complicated, and you could end up at the tribunal fighting about the price.
I'm
but-
just sort of thinking, if we can't actually get together and negotiate this now, when it's
No,
been
I agree.
offered to us, it's going to be hugely harder.
Some people couldn't control the money now, but say, could we have a year to do so? Would it be open to other participants to enter into a loan and say, well, we'll fund you, but you pay us back in a year's time?
Yeah.
We can... Yeah, it's a white knight, but the point is...
But it's slightly different. It's a different way of doing it.
It just struck me
yeah.
as worth
Yeah.
mentioning that in
No,
case
no.
somebody says, well, I'll lend you the money for 2% or 3% a year,
Yeah.
whatever, and then at least we can go ahead and buy this thing,
Yeah.
knowing there's no white knight in it.
Yes, that's another. Yeah, that's an option certainly to agree amongst.
It must be worth thinking about.
My sense, it's probably worth saying with this white knight, perhaps you can talk to us for a minute about your experience with these white knights, because my sense is that it's a quite reasonable. People are a bit worried about these third-party investors, but the sense I got from both you and Graham was that there's a lot of these people about. They're perfectly respectable people.
They're just property investors, and they invest because the return is slightly better than the interest rate, and they just sit there and they wait for someone to seek a lease extension. And then they'll get a sort of windfall.
And they're not involved. They don't have to have any decision-making power in terms of the block whatsoever. So they simply are a sort of silent,
It's like a
partner
sleeping
in the-
partner,
sleeping
effectively.
partner,
Yeah.
Yes.
Gold medal is we all do it communally,
Yeah.
silver would be a white knight.
Yeah.
And, we have to go down that route in order to get this freehold. I think we would all take it, but let's look at options. I do like the idea of the loan arrangements. We can be creative as long as it's to timetable.
We've got this 30-day timetable, on which I would say that Natasha has had, because of Natasha's law firm, like all law firms, has to get, you'll all know this, they have to do the know your client stuff and get proof of identity of people they are accepting money from. So we've both given Natasha this evening copies of the documentation she needs. And what that means is that if you are content with this, I'll send an email around, but if you either write me a cheque or send me electronically £500, I can then forward that on to Natasha, and it can go into Forster's client account where it can sit, and we can, over the next month, we can get together, hopefully, 36 people. But if not all possible, 39 people would be the absolute ideal. Everybody other than the directors of Type Team. But at least 19. And then that buys us then the time for the next stage of the process, where we can then work out how we fill the funding gap.
That £500, does that effectively commit us and bind us to the greater liability once it's worked out?
No.
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 Just clarify.
Is there a possibility for people like me who don't do email and all of that to use the ordinary postal system to send you money?
Yes,
Do you accept that?
I would absolutely accept that.
I don't have these machines and I don't want them.
No. Well, we've managed to get by so far, I think, using phone calls.
But you know, how do I know?
No,
I
absolutely.
don't have email. You can't tell me if something has changed.
All I would say is, if you do, anyone that sends me checks, I'll put it in. Well, I'll tell you now. Actually, if you did send me a check, please just make sure you put your flat number on the back of the check, so I can make sure I keep a note of which one it is. But yeah. So that I think is a really important first step. Valerie is holding up this board. That's another reason why this signature board went round. So I think anybody that didn't just complete the missing details, that would be really helpful, so that we can get everybody together.
Do we want an initial show of interest of yes, no, maybe?
Yeah. So initial in principle. Hands up if in principle you're interested, which is hopefully why you're. And maybes? Any
I
maybes?
suppose I should put myself as a maybe funding wise.
As a sort of positive note, I don't know if anyone's done this before, but I'm an estate agent, and don't make me. Basically, from my experience, people with a share of freehold tend to sell their flats far easier than a lease of 9 seasons, 100 years. So anyone who has 91 years really should have a much easier time and probably sell that quite a lot. If you just compared it to identical flat, so even without a share of freehold, double what you just quoted. So if you're looking at the same flat, which is sold recently, comparable, that had a 91-year lease, the second share of freehold at 999, you're probably looking at double the premium that you quoted earlier as a rough guideline.
So about 20,000 more, something like that.
Because buyers really want to have
Yeah,
control.
so it does come back quite quickly, potentially.
Yeah.
It's a $1 million question, but I think we'll have to see, because you don't want to miss the date. But I do recommend that you do it as soon as possible. The cut-off date really is 1 month after the acceptance notice, because that's when costs become. You start incurring costs for the other side if you withdraw. So, and I'd suggest that you do it as soon as possible, really, because you all want to know that you're all on the same page and you're all agreeing the same things. You will need to instruct the valuer just so you know exactly what premium you're signing up to paying. So that is obviously a step before.
Is there a possibility that, and I don't know anything about this freeholder, but once we've got over the 90, we could then say, look, are you, it's going to take us a bit of time, I don't know what they're like, are they decent, can we have 3 months or 4 months? I mean, is there a negotiation to be had? Because I'm just conscious of your point that it takes time to get funding. Might we be able to approach them and just say, can we have a without prejudice conversation? Will you give us a bit more time than strictly under the Act?
You can ask for an extension on the acceptance date, but it's completely at the, it's completely up to Type Team whether or not they'll say yes or no.
What's the relationship with Type Team like?
I mean, I have dealt with them in the past. They're quite a savvy organisation, but I understand. I mean, it sounds as if they're going through a sale because of the restructuring. I don't know.
I mean, I couldn't read too much into it. Mr. Sirota was not inclined, and for reasons of data protection, he wasn't inclined to share any details of any of the other leaseholders with me. Rupa managed to persuade Paul Collis at Hathaway's to forward an email around, which he singularly refused to do for me, but Rupa's obviously got powers of persuasion that I lack. But then when I asked him again a day or two ago to forward round to the 3 people I've not been able to get hold of to tell them about this meeting, he used a form of words, I think, along the lines of, unfortunately, we cannot give you any further assistance, which I took to mean we have been told by Type Team not to help you. And not unreasonably, I can imagine from Type Team's point of view, it would be a lot simpler just to sell to whoever they've agreed the price with, and that's what they would prefer to do because they can.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to find that if you request, they say no, because they're doing this because they want to push on with a sale.
What exactly do you, I mean, I know you said all this at the beginning, but now that we've run through so many options, what has to happen in the next month? I mean, we have to obviously, if we want to, we have to accept, and so you need for that, but you don't need the participation agreement for that, you just need people's commitment in email, or how does that work actually in terms of what has to happen in this month, and what will be great if we can achieve in this month?
Well, if you can get the participation done this month, that's the best evidence, and it means that you're all tied into, and you all know exactly what you're signing up to.
Okay.
So I would recommend that, but you need to get the valuer to advise you first on the premium, so you need to instruct the valuer, and then we need to set up the company. Again, setting up the company is not so urgent because you only have to tell the company 2 months after you accept, but I think for the bank account and everything it might make things simpler. But instructing the valuer, giving us some form of agreement that we can show as evidence of you participating, and if you're going to do a participation agreement, you might as well just get it done. So I would recommend doing those 2 immediately.
But the value is the most important.
Value is the most important because you need to know.
And so once you've got your £5 million from people who are interested in that, then that would be the first thing we do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think, look, if we all put in £500, let's say, I mean, I think if we got to say 12 people putting in £500, that would roughly cover the cost of the valuer and the and setting up the company, but it probably wouldn't cover much of Forster's costs. So we need to sort of get as much of that money in as quickly as possible, and then.
Quickly gives the valuer the most amount of time to get this right, so we're clear on the obligations and have time to think.
Yes.
Basically, if we leave this for 3 weeks and they've got a week to turn it around, that'll be a very high pressure deadline.
And to start conversations with your mortgagee or mortgagee about whether they will increase the. Perhaps our friend the estate agent can tell us, but I can't see why your building society or bank, if you've got a mortgage with them, all other things being equal, I would have thought they'd be very happy to make a further advance to fund the acquisition of the share of the freehold.
I don't really deal with mortgages, it's not really my.
No.
Are we looking to see the valuation? So is the valuation, I mean, they do their own valuations and stuff, but if we have the evidence of valuer, then that supports the increase in loan to value for them to extend it.
They can probably confirm it.
They're very warm to it.
Say something, please. I've got time constraints, so I need to go. So thank you for arranging the meeting, and just email me.
Will do. Thank you.
Yeah, no.
You're welcome to.
If you want to, this is so basic. It just sets out the.
Thank you very much.
Great to have somebody here tonight.
I'm Robert Cass.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Cheers. Thanks, Josh. I think, are there any other questions? We might have reached a natural endpoint. So thank you all for coming along.
Thank you for organising this, for rallying us all.
Pleasure. If anybody wants to carry on having a chat, then I'm very happy to. Could possibly go and have a chat in the wine bar down the road. Thank you.